and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. My name is Mike Williams, Education Project Manager for the NHC, and today's session is entitled Me Too Movement in Historical Context. Our leader for this session is Dr. Kimberly Hamlin, Professor of History at Miami University. We also have a guest moderator who will be joining us specifically for this session. Dr. Tisha Hooks of New Haven, Connecticut will be here as well. As we begin, I want to extend a special shout out to my team, my colleagues in the Education Department, who are Andy Mink, our Vice President for Education Programs, who leads the Center's efforts to strengthen humanities teaching at both the collegiate and pre-collegiate levels. Through Andy's visionary leadership, we've expanded our webinars, interactive classroom lessons, and extensive digital archives of primary source materials. Jira Lego, who's our Education Programs Coordinator, and Jira is also here with us tonight. You may see her in the chat. But Jira is our primary contact between the scholars and the webinars. She works tirelessly with the scholars to prepare their PowerPoints, collect the readings, and we're so appreciative of the work that she's doing behind the scenes for this series. And again, my name is Mike Williams, Education Project Manager, and my role is to help manage the Education Department's digital materials, online course offerings, and programming. We also have Meredith Graham, who is our digital project specialist, who oversees content research, course development, as well as ongoing metadata work. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina, and for 44 years, we've supported the best in humanities scholarship and humanities education. We're the only nonprofit institution devoted exclusively to the study of the humanities. And here at the center, our education programs serves as a nexus between our scholars and educators. Our goal is to build the bridges between the scholarly world and the everyday classroom. And we support educators at all levels, with a large majority being at the K through 12 level. But we do have collegiate and graduate level educators as well. Please know that we also have a wealth of resources available from tonight's webinar and others in the Humanities in Class digital library. As members of the library, you have ready access to these materials and will also have access to the recording of this webinar once it is posted. We encourage you to go in the same way that you would any library and explore other resources as well. You will find resources from scholarly organizations, research centers, archive sites, and museums, among many others. We'd also recommend visiting our curated collections that allow you to explore specific themes. For example, the resources that you can use in your classroom from the Me Too movement in historical context collection here that you see on the screen as well. We also like to invite you all to check out our remaining three webinars for the season with Daniel Kielman, Christopher Capozzola, and Christine Haas. The next session will be held on April 28th, so we hope you all will join us there. As you can see, all three will be delving into a range of compelling topics that could be easily applied in your respective classrooms or instructional environments. All of the work that I'm describing is informed by the strong and talented Teacher Advisory Council. We have a team of educators across the country who are giving us feedback and consult with us on various projects. We're currently accepting applications for our 2022-2023 council, and we encourage you all to apply if you're interested in being more actively involved in the center and have a voice in this work, that impactful work that we all are doing. Tonight's webinar is audio and PowerPoint based, so you will not see Dr. Hamlin directly, but you'll be able to interact with her and our guest moderator, Tisha, through the chat box. There are two primary chat boxes. One is the audience chat box, where you can interact among each other, and the other is the speaker chat box for any questions that you may have for Dr. Hamlin. Tisha will also be monitoring those questions and bringing them to Dr. Hamlin's attention throughout the presentation. Again, we thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules and commitments to join us this evening. You're attending the webinar entitled Me Too Movement in Historical Context. For tonight's webinar, we're fortunate to have two members of our current Teacher Advisory Council present. As I mentioned before, Dr. Tisha Hooks of the Hopkins School in New Haven, Connecticut. She'll serve as our guest moderator. You will hear her voice shortly. We're also joined tonight by Erica Shaw of Concord, California, who will serve as our TA for tonight's session. Erica will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions. So without further ado, we'll get started. Dr. Kimberly Hamlin, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's session. For our attendees, I'll provide you a little bit of information about Dr. Hamlin. Dr. Hamlin is an award-winning historian, author, and James and Beth Lewis Professor of History at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Her research focuses on the histories of women's rights, women's political activism, and the cultural construction of ideas about gender and sex. Her most recent book, Freethinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, tells the fascinating story of the fallen woman who reinvented herself and became the most potent factor in congressional passage of the 19th Amendment and the highest-ranking woman in federal government. Freethinker centers both sex and race in the history of women's rights and in the long struggle for the vote. This project received both the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award and the Carrie Chapman Catt Award for research on women in politics. Dr. Hamlin is also the author of From Eve to Evolution, Darwin's Science, and Women's Rights in Gilded Age America. We are very fortunate to have you here tonight, Dr. Hamlin. And at this time, I'm going to switch control of the mouse on over to you. Am I coming through clearly? Are you there?
Yes, I hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me loud and clear?
I can. And again, just thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are looking forward to hearing from you.
Mike, thank you so much. And thank you for that fabulous mix to kick off our conversations tonight. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I really want to thank, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening to talk about what I think is one of the most vital, most entrenched, and most under-talked about, if that is a word, issues in our culture and in our nation's history, and that is sexual violence. I know there are many more comfortable, more pleasant, and more uplifting things you could be doing this evening, but I'm really glad that you chose to spend it here with us at tonight's National Humanities Center webinar. April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so our evening is particularly well-timed thanks to the NHC's organizational geniuses, including Andy Mink and Jira, who have planned tonight's webinar and this year's amazing slate of speakers, of which I'm so honored to be a part. I also want to thank Mike, Tisha, and Erica for leading tonight's presentation. You might be asking yourself, why should we teach and talk about the history of sexual violence? Well, there are many answers to that. But first, I want to tell you why I teach and write about the history of sexual violence. And that is for my students at Miami University. At Miami, where I've been since 2007, I teach classes on the history of women, the history of sex and gender, and the history of medicine, all of which inevitably include discussions of rape culture and sexual violence. And every semester, for years, long before the Me Too movement became front page news in 2017, students come to me and share their own stories and experiences with me. One particular semester, an award-winning student and campus leader told me her story, and she concluded by saying, "But really, I'm lucky. My rape wasn't that bad." She said, "At least I had only one attacker, and at least I did not contract an STI like so many of my friends have." And I heard her story on so many levels, but mostly I heard it as a call to action. In what universe do we send our children to college where they are more or less expecting to be sexually assaulted, and when they feel, quote, lucky if their rapes aren't, quote, that bad? Well, this is our universe, and sexual assault is a public health crisis, on college campuses and beyond, where so many of your students are or might soon be headed. These statistics are from RAIN.org. If you want to check out their website, they have many resources. This is just a few to highlight some of the statistics that have prompted me to go into this sort of teaching. Among undergraduate students, more than a quarter of females and nearly 7% of males experience rape or sexual assault while they are on campus. College women are twice as likely to be sexually assaulted than robbed. Even more troubling, nearly all perpetrators go unpunished, and the vast majority of sexual assaults on campuses or otherwise go unreported. Every 68 seconds, another American is sexually assaulted. At the same time, more than 80% of women and 34% of men report having been sexually harassed in our workplaces, our schools, and our society. And this is from a comprehensive 2018 report. The American Academy of University Women has compiled a cumulative report on the lifelong impacts of sexual harassment, impacts on earnings, on career trajectories, and on overall health. I included this report in the course materials for tonight, and as you will see, the findings are chilling. As the AAUW finds, workplace sexual harassment can take a toll on women's physical and mental health, limit their job choices, reduce prospects for career development, and even force them out of the workforce. These negative effects compound over time, reducing women's lifetime earnings and contributing to both the gender and retirement wage gaps. And of course, as we know, men too can be sexually harassed and sexually assaulted, and our LGBTQ students are at extremely heightened risk for these sorts of assaults. So this is why I think it's important to think and talk about sexual assault and sexual violence. One of the problems we face in combating sexual assault and sexual harassment is our tendency to treat it as interpersonal and individual, as a sort of one bad apple problem. And this is particularly true in workplace HR trainings. Sexual violence, however, is not a question of a few bad apples, nor is it best understood as some sort of interpersonal issue between individuals. Sexual violence is an institutional and structural problem, often related to racism, that is endemic to our nation's history and, I suggest, best understood in historical context. That is why we are here tonight, to think critically about the stories we tell about ourselves as a nation and as a people, and to ask ourselves, what other stories might we tell? Whose voices might we spotlight? And whose transgressions should we maybe not gloss over anymore? One of my conclusions in my years of teaching about the history of sexual violence is that we cannot teach patriarchy and expect equality. And I'm going to elaborate more on what I mean by that tonight. When we educators, especially those of you who work in K-12 public schools, are faced with an onslaught of new proposals and regulations about what you can teach, what you can assign, or even what words you can say in the classroom, you might be rightfully asking, but what can I do to integrate our nation's long history of sexual violence into the classroom? That is what we're going to be discussing and brainstorming tonight. And in some cases, you may not be able to say out loud in your classrooms some of the things we're going to talk about. But this history can nevertheless inform how you approach the material in your state standards, the primary sources you assign, and the conclusions your students are able to draw for themselves. The first order of business in attempting to broach topics related to sexual violence is to establish classroom community standards and define terms. And this was the first thing we did in my class that you see here that I taught for the first time in fall 2020 on Zoom because of the pandemic, my History of Me Too class, and I'm going to teach it again this fall, which I'm really excited about. We came up with a document that we called Classroom Community Standards, where we established how we're going to talk to each other, how we're going to interact with each other, how we're going to handle any disputes. And I pulled together some resources, some of which I include in your course materials, in particular the article from JSTOR Daily called The Vocabulary Primer You Need for Talking About Sexual Assault and Harassment. So that was our first step. We also defined some definitions, including what exactly is sexual assault. And from there, we drew on the Justice Department's definition that sexual assault means any non-consensual sexual act as prohibited by federal, tribal, or state law, including when the victim lacks capacity to consent. And we defined sexual harassment, also according to federal standards, as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we're going to talk more about it, but we also defined and distinguished between the two main forms of sexual harassment: quid pro quo, I'll do this for you, you do that for me, and hostile environment. The other term that's really central to any discussions of sexual assault and really feminism and race in America is intersectionality, the term coined by legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, but articulated by African American women since the 19th century. I included a link to a talk by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw that I highly recommend you watch if you haven't already. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her and her work, but in case you are not, intersectionality is the theory that various forms of discrimination centered on race, class, gender, disability, and sexuality, along with other forms of identity, do not work independently on separate axes, so to speak, but interact to produce particularized forms of social oppression. As such, oppression is the result of intersecting forms of exclusionary practices. And for our purposes tonight, we're going to be thinking a lot about the way in which both racism and sexism often collide in sexual assault and sexual harassment. Another definition or important context for us to think about is, what is the Me Too movement? I think that already came up in the chat. What precisely are we talking about? Well, it's important to recognize that the Me Too movement did not start in 2017 when some famous white actresses began posting about it on social media, but in fact it started over a decade before when Tarana Burke founded the movement in 2006. Another core theme of our discussion tonight, and of really any discussion of sexual violence in America, is the long history of Black women and other women of color leading the fight against sexual violence from the 19th century to today. I encourage you to watch Tarana Burke's Chautauqua lecture and pay attention to the leaders that we discussed tonight. So tonight we're going to be thinking about the Me Too movement, in part about the recent movement, but also we're going to think about it as a much longer movement, and we're going to include both women's formal activism and also women's informal whisper networks that have existed to fight sexual violence and for bodily autonomy. And when we think of it this way, the Me Too movement is really as old as our nation itself. Tonight, I've attempted to distill my material into 3 main points, with related primary and secondary readings in the course materials. After each of the main points, we'll pause for questions and discussion. And my colleague Tisha will moderate and bring the questions to me, because I have found, unfortunately, that I am incapable of reading the chat and talking at the same time. So that is our plan. Point number 1. Sexual violence is endemic to our country's history and has often been used to maintain white rule. What do I mean by this? Well, in my Me Too class, we start with the story of Pocahontas, and we contrast the Disney version with the historical primary sources that document Pocahontas' experiences and more recent work that centers Native women's voices. We find in our study of primary documents that Pocahontas did not save and marry Captain John Smith because she loved him, like the Disney movie tells us. Quite to the contrary, she married John Rolfe, the very man who later brought people of African descent to the Virginia colony to be enslaved, because she thought that marrying John Rolfe was a way for her to engage in tribal diplomacy. Seen in this light, the portrait of Pocahontas that you see here, one of the very few images of women to adorn our nation's capital, looks very different. Several of my students have commented that while this painting is technically titled The Baptism of Pocahontas to document her conversion to Christianity before her marriage, it could also be interpreted as the rape of Pocahontas. What does it mean that one of our nation's most beloved founding stories involves the coercive marriage of a Native woman to an Anglo settler? What connections can we draw between this foundational story and the alarmingly high rates of sexual assault that Native women continue to experience to this day? I think we can discern many things, one of which is that sexual assault has a history, and that this history is very much intertwined with the history of our nation, its settlement, its westward expansion, and its economy. For an excellent resource on this, I want to commend you to Stanford historian Estelle Friedman's work, her book, Redefining Rape, and the introduction to it that I included in the course materials. And here, Estelle Friedman argues that rape has a political history. And she's arguing here how the meaning of rape changes over time, and that the history of repeated struggles over the meaning of sexual violence reveals that the way we understand rape helps determine who is entitled to sexual and political sovereignty, and who may fully exercise the rights of American citizenship. Sometimes when I give other versions of this talk, I title it, Are Women Full Citizens? And spoiler alert, the answer is no, because I think that political autonomy and bodily autonomy go hand in hand, and that you can't have one without the other. A hallmark of American jurisprudence, as Estelle Friedman and others have established, is that American law has racialized rape from the very beginning. And this is in the early years as the colonies became the states and distinguished American law from English common law. And what I mean by this is that rape became understood as something that could only happen to white women, generally white women who were somehow quote unquote respectable, and could only be perpetrated by Black men. This is in contradistinction to other rape laws in other countries and is one of the most unique elements of American law. And it, of course, is a result of enslavement, one of the most, or really the most, blatant and brutal example of the racialization of sexual assault. My students are generally surprised to learn that after the U.S. banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808, the numbers of enslaved people in the U.S. increased, not decreased, meaning that the forced reproduction of African women became central to enslavement for more than 50 years. This is a horrifying truth that we must not shy away from. The rape and sexual assault of enslaved women of African descent is a central theme in abolitionist literature, including Uncle Tom's Cabin, and in slave narratives, including Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, which I'm guessing one or both of this might be on your syllabi. Harriet Jacobs recounts in her memoir, sometimes in veiled language, sometimes not, how it was her fear of being raped by her enslaver, Dr. Norcom, that motivated her to escape and hide in her grandmother's attic for 7 years. Students can plainly see the sexualization of Harriet Jacobs in the ads that her enslaver purchased and circulated that you see here in an attempt to find her after her escape. And here you can see James Norcom is describing her as a light mulatto girl, 21 years old, about 5'4", of a thick and corpulent habit, having on her head a thick covering of black hair that curls naturally, but which can be carefully combed straight. He goes on to talk about how she looks and her style and her skills. And you can see he doesn't just want her for her unpaid labor, but it's also highly sexualized, which is precisely why she fled from him. Another window into this brutal reality of the forced rape and breeding of enslaved women that I've begun teaching in my classes, including my history of medicine class, is the origins of gynecology in Southern slavery. And here I'm drawing on the work of historian Deirdre Cooper Owens. Deirdre Cooper Owens, in her book Medical Bondage, lays out how physicians like J. Marion Sims, pictured here, the man lauded as the father of gynecology, honed his surgeries, his techniques, and his reputation on the bodies of enslaved women who could not consent to treatment, but whose fertility their owners needed to ensure. Recently, the statue of Sims in Central Park has been removed. One way to approach this history then will be to tie it into ongoing discussions about the statues and memorials we have across our landscape, whose stories we tell, whose we valorize, and whose perhaps it's time to edit or remove. Perhaps the most clear and powerful articulation of the racialized roots of sexual assault come in the words of anti-lynching activist Ida B. Wells. As one of only a handful of American women to make it into multiple state standards, and when I say things like that, I'm drawing on a report that we can talk about later, or I can share in the chat, by the National Women's History Museum, compiled in 2017, called Where Are the Women? So I'm guessing that Ida B. Wells is already in your textbooks, but I'm also guessing that perhaps her specific critique of lynching has maybe been glossed over, depending on which state you are living in. For a detailed account of Wells's critique of lynching, I suggest her book, The Red Record, which I included in the course materials. Her primary points as a journalist and what she did to convince first the world and then a reluctant United States that lynching was not about, some sort of rampant problem of black male racists, but instead about white supremacy, is that she established with her careful reporting, going place by place, lynching by lynching, she established that lynching had nothing to do with black men and their sexuality, but everything to do with their economic and political power, that the black men most likely to be lynched were those who owned successful businesses, who published their ideas in newspapers, who dared run for office. Furthermore, she pointed out the corollary to this harmful, deadly myth of the black male rapist, and that is that most interracial rapes were white men raping black women. And I see there's a typo in that slide. Sorry, it's supposed to say rapist. So those are her two main points in one place where you could really delve in to the way in which rape has been used as a tool of white supremacy and of white rule since the beginning of our nation's history. That is sort of the gist of part one. So I wanted to pause here. We've been thinking and talking for almost half an hour, and I want to invite your questions, comments, concerns. Tisha, what do people want to talk about so far?
Thank you, Professor Hamlin. This has just been astounding so far. I actually want to raise a couple of questions that go back to the very beginning when you were introducing your classroom and how you approach this subject, and then head into questions that have to do very specifically with the historical trajectory that we've begun with you. First actually has to go back, it goes back to how you organize your classroom. You talked about setting up classroom norms and having discussion about what is really meant, what do you mean in this classroom, what your vocabulary will be. Why is it, or how important is it to put that document down into something that moves beyond conversation but is actually physical and can be passed amongst the students themselves? What's the importance of that aspect of your
That's such a great question. And I had proposed this Me Too class in the fall of 2019 when no one could have imagined the pandemic, right? Or even that we would one day teach classes on Zoom. So when it came to pass that I was going to have to teach this for the first time on Zoom, I panicked a little and I thought, I don't know if I can do this. How can we establish, trust and a sense of camaraderie together when we never see each other in person? So I don't know that I would have thought to build this collaborative document if it weren't for this Zoom environment, but now I'm going to always do it. What we did was we made a Google Doc. And at first we had, kind of a classroom brainstorming session where I think me and one of the other students kind of served as a scribe. And then I cleaned up the document a little to, put things in full sentences and arrange it in an order. And then we had a week of, kind of a comment period where students could make suggestions or changes. And I also included in my syllabus and on our Canvas, that's the learning platform we use in our Canvas site, links to campus resources, national resources, nonprofit resources, because I feel that while this is super vital to talk about, it's also highly charged, right? And I am not a licensed therapist. I'm not a police officer. I'm not an attorney. So I wanted to have students have a place to, if they wanted to bring up things that was sort of beyond my ability or place, really, that they knew where to go. So it was both about resources and about establishing a sense of trust and that we are a community. And that was really important because one of the things that a lot of the students said was they wanted to be able to talk openly, and they weren't saying so much that they were scared about saying their stories. They were more saying they were scared of saying the wrong word or something that might be hurtful to a student who was, expressing something from a vulnerable place. And so we kind of established we're going to give each other some grace and the benefit of the doubt and know that we're trying our best and we're in this together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We actually have a question from Ricardo, who is asking if you could just reiterate a bit about how you became interested in this topic. What is your motivation behind telling these stories and this history?
That's a great question. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in the next section when I talk about my more recent book. So, I'm a historian of women. That's sort of my nutshell definition. But as I write and publish, I find myself drawn more to women's activism, to women's rights. And over the years, I've found that more often than not, this history of women's rights is really fundamentally tied up with the history of women's bodily autonomy. And so I think to talk more about, women as political agents, women as equal citizens, we also have to talk about women's bodily autonomy, which could mean both rape and also comprehensive reproductive health care. So I talk about that not tonight, obviously, but in some of my other classes. So, it's not something I initially wrote about, but it's kind of, now that I have been writing and doing this for 15-ish years, I'm seeing the thread. And I feel like also now that I'm older, I guess, that I feel called to do this and to help my students and to really work for change on our campus and to be a resource and an ally for them. So I serve also as the faculty advisor to our feminist student club called F-Word, and I'm on our campus sexual assault, I forget the name of the group, but it's sort of a faculty, student, staff group, because I really feel that we need to make change on our campuses, that it really is a public health crisis.
And actually, in response to that, Raquel is asking if the perpetrators in college rapes are other college students. Is that what you're finding?
Mostly yes. Not always, but mostly yes.
And then we have a question please continue.
I was just going to, there's one resource that I don't have a slide about, but I find that the best book on this is called Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus. And if you Google it, you'll find that the authors, Jennifer Hurst and Seamus Khan, have a wonderful website with all kinds of resources and information and best practices. And they're really suggesting ways we can kind of transform our college campuses, if that's where you are or that's what you're interested in, to make them safer for all our students.
Thank you, Professor Hamlin. And one more question, and this is a question actually that has to do with Harriet Jacobs. In her narrative, she was not believed. She was not believed prior to that 7-year period of hiding. There was some controversy about that. Could you, Sharon in Denver asks if you could say more about the question of believability in some of these historical instances, like particularly with regard to women of color.
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. And there's a wonderful book by Sharon Block that I teach in my Me Too class. And in it, she talks about, it's a more detailed look at how rape became racialized. And she includes the kind of legal jargon that draws on this guy named Matthew Hale, who was a British jurist. And he laid out the criteria that distinguish, because at first in the colonies, rape was a capital crime. So basically, hardly anyone got charged with rape, but the people who did get charged were not white. And as rape became not a capital crime, you got bigger parameters about who could bring forth charges of rape. And the Matthew Hale criteria, and we'll have to convene later once I've reviewed my notes on this. I'm paraphrasing here, but they're basically that, a woman, they're absurd, right? Like a woman had to scream and be heard by others. There had to be evidence of resistance, and she had to have immediately told someone, like all sorts of contradictory things that basically make it impossible, especially for a woman of color who was working, as a domestic servant maybe, or who was enslaved to ever bring forward. So we talk about how this sort of Matthew Hale believability issue is endemic to American law. And another great book that we read on this is Michelle Boulder's memoir called Is Rape a Crime? A Memoir, Something, and a Manifesto. A Memoir, an Investigation, and a Manifesto.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we are ready for part 2.
Point number 2. Okay. So point number 2, and this is when the person asked kind of how I came to this is the part more about my personal research. So I've come to believe that sexual violence has long motivated women's entry into reform and public life, even when women could not say this directly. We can see this with the examples of Harriet Jacobs, with Ida B. Wells, and with the way in which descriptions of sexual violence against enslaved women served as a vital recruitment tool during the abolition movement. In my own research, I've come to believe that really above all else, sexual violence, either actual or potential, is what motivated women to begin organizing and going to meetings as women in the early 19th century. Historians will probably debate me on this, and you can debate me too in the chat, but I will explain why I think this is. The very first groups of women to organize as women were not temperance groups or even abolitionist ladies' auxiliaries, but so-called female moral reform societies of the 1830s and 1840s. These women were concerned about the growing presence of prostitution in their towns and about the entrenchment of the sexual double standard that prostitution heralded, meaning they weren't so much concerned about the prostitutes as they were about it becoming the accepted norm that, quote, boys will be boys, and that there's good women and bad women. As we discussed in section 1, the sexual assault of Black women was also used as a recruitment tool by abolitionists, especially to get white women in the North to sign on to the movement. And temperance and women's rights were also fundamentally concerned with women's bodily autonomy. As I'm about to share why I think this, 19th century women's rights activists came to understand that bodily autonomy and political autonomy are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other. And I came to this conclusion while researching and writing my 2020 book that Mike mentioned. It's called Free Thinker, and it's the biography of this remarkable fallen woman, meaning she had sex before marriage and everyone found out about it, who reinvented herself, changed her name, and ended up moving to Washington, becoming the suffragist most effective lobbyist, and by the time she died in 1925, the highest ranking woman in federal government and a national symbol of what it meant for women, or at least white women, to be full citizens. For Gardner, that's her name, Helen Hamilton Gardner, her goal was not the vote. Her goal was to create a society, as she wrote, in which women were considered self-respecting, self-directing human units with brains and bodies that are sacredly their own. And I just love this. This is something she said in her eulogy for her best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in 1902. And I love it because I think it really encapsulates her sort of mission, but also the links between political autonomy and bodily autonomy. She came to this conclusion after she herself was outed in Ohio papers for having an affair with a married man when she was a 23-year-old school teacher. The man was an older elected official. He was the Ohio Commissioner of Schools, and he had told her that he was divorced and that he was going to marry her. Of course, he was totally not divorced, and she had an affair with him, and everyone in the town found out about it, and it made its way into newspapers across the entire state because this guy was an elected official. So Alice Chenoweth, that was her birth name, was forced to resign her hard-won job, basically the only job a middle-class white woman could have in the 1870s, and she was run out of town. Meanwhile, her lover, of course, carries on more or less unscathed. So this contrast, I think, is what started her on her life path of feminist reform, to eradicate the sexual double standard and to work for both bodily autonomy and political autonomy. She did this in many venues before turning her attention to the vote. And just to clarify, after the scandal, she moves to New York City and changes her name from Alice Chenoweth to Helen Hamilton Gardner. And she never told anyone that she was a fallen woman or about this scandal. So I felt sort of conflicted revealing it in my book because it was a secret she worked so hard to obscure her whole life. But this phrase you see here is it's from the frontispiece to her first novel that she published in 1890. And I think it explains how she came to think about the sexual double standard. And I hear her own personal experiences in this quote. She writes, "A man is valued of men for many things, least of which is his chastity. A woman is valued of men for few things, chief of which is her chastity. This double code can by no sane or reasonable person be claimed as a woman made." And what she wanted to do was break this double code. And to do it, she turned to fiction. She knew she could not write openly about sex or sexual assault due to the Comstock laws and many other things we could talk about. So she did so in fiction. And for her two first novels, one is called Is This Your Son, My Lord? And the other, Pray You, Sir, Whose Daughter? She sought to dramatize this plight of so-called fallen women and to really encourage people to empathize with them and to really understand how few choices women, especially young women, have or had when it came to romance and heterosexual relationships. For these efforts, she became known as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen women, meaning as an activist who used fiction to draw public empathy and to draw a really sort of latent public cause to popular attention. Through these novels, she honed in on a really particularly galling aspect of the sexual double standard, and that is the age of consent. The age of consent is the legal age at which a child, in this case, was considered capable of consenting to sex with a grown man. I'll invite you in the chat to guess what you think the age of sexual consent was for girls in 1890. I'm going to check the chat and see. No guesses yet. Okay, I will tell you. 14. Oh, good guess, Tisha. No. 12. Yep. The age of sexual consent for girls was 12 or 10 in 38 states. In Delaware, it was 7. You may ask why, and again, it goes back to British common law, and when British legal theorists thought that a girl began menstruating, and so they tied the beginning of menstruation with ability to consent to sex with grown men. Yes, in the chat, that is exactly right. That's why it was 10 or 12 in 38 states. So to reformers like Gardner, this was a galling and horrifying example of the sexual double standard. So the people leading the movement to raise the age of sexual consent were the women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, Helen Hamilton Gardner was a free thinker, meaning atheist. That's how she first entered reform. And she did not believe in temperance. She sort of thought everyone should be trusted to do as they wish. But she joins forces and makes sort of strange bedfellows, if you will, with the women of the Women's Christian Temperance Union to work to raise the age of sexual consent in the 1890s. This is a picture from a magazine called The Arena. Helen Hamilton Gardner's at the very top. Frances Willard is like at 10 o'clock under and to the left of Gardner. She's the longtime president of the WCTU. And these are the women the women and men leading the campaign to raise the age of sexual consent for girls. Now, what I think is really fascinating about this is that at first, in 1890, the majority of Women's Christian Temperance Union women, which numbered over 200,000, it's a far bigger movement than the suffrage movement at this time, most of these women did not support the vote. They thought that was a step too far. They thought that, they kind of believed the lie that our sons, our fathers, our brothers, our fathers, our husbands' vote was our best interest at heart. They thought, you know what, we'll just go to the state legislatures and we'll say, hey guys, did you know that in your state the age of sexual consent is 10? And they will say, holy cow, I had no idea we should raise it. Well, that is not remotely what happened. The women were mocked, they were ignored. Even when states did agree to raise the ages, they often inserted invalidating language, which we'll talk more about in a second, in the laws. So this is what convinces women, in the women of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in particular, I think, that women need the vote. And it was during these age of consent campaigns of the 1890s that Helen Hamilton Gardner, who, remember, eventually is going to become the suffragist most powerful lobbyist in DC, this is where she learns about politics. This is where she learns how a bill becomes a law and how you need to move things along in all male legislatures where women have no vote. So it's a really important movement that we don't often talk about. The reformers' goal was to raise the age of consent all the way to 18, which was the age of majority for other things. Several reformers wanted it to be the same for boys and girls, but most state legislatures thought that was ridiculous, that boys will be boys, and that it really should only apply to girls. Why was the WCTU interested in this? Well, as Frances Willard, seated here in the middle, explained, the Siamese twins of vice are strong drink and the degradation of women. And I highlight that quote here too, because I think it's an important link to our ongoing conversations about sexual assault on college campuses. So throughout the 1890s, these reformers had various limited successes in raising the age of sexual consent state by state. They found that the states where they had the best luck and where they were able to raise the age of sexual consent all the way to 18 or at least to 16 were the states in which women could vote. And this, in the 1890s, is Colorado, Wyoming, and Kansas. These are the only states that raised the age of consent to 16 or 18. And the Colorado example particularly proved this to women. Colorado enfranchised women in 1894, and in 1895, 3 women were elected to the Colorado State Legislature, including Carrie Clyde Holly, who has the distinction of introducing the very first piece of legislation ever proposed by a woman. What was her bill? Well, it was to raise the age of sexual consent. She wanted it to apply to both boys and girls. It was somewhat diluted in committee, but she ends up succeeding. So this was cheered by suffragists. This was cheered by temperance activists as what is possible when women not only have the vote, but also a seat at the legislative table. So for those of you in Colorado, I wonder if she's in your state standards, if there's a way you could incorporate this story in your Colorado history lessons. Another important part of this history, so part one that's important is that I think it really shows how bodily autonomy and the fight against sexual assault and sexual violence really motivates temperance activists and women's rights activists. I also see this in their conversations about syphilis, which is sort of a side note for tonight, but syphilis was by far the most prevalent infectious disease of the 19th century, more than all the other infectious diseases combined. And I think Helen Hamilton Gardner's lover had it, so I've become attuned to sort of reading the coded ways in which women talk about this. And that also is what got a lot of women to go to temperance meetings. So my new project is a retelling of the temperance movement, centering sex, sexual assault, and syphilis. But the other really important piece of this is that these age of consent laws, even when women were able to get them raised and passed, generally did not apply to African American girls. Estelle Friedman has a whole chapter on this in Redefining Rape, and especially in Southern states. Southern legislators would include clauses that said these laws only pertained to white girls or to girls who could prove that they had been virgins at the time. Why? Because white men had been sexually assaulting and raping women of color since the origins of enslavement, and it remains a powerful tool of white supremacy after emancipation and especially during Reconstruction. So that is this sad history of age of consent laws, which also presages and prefigures how the 19th Amendment came to pass, which also we could talk more about later and is possibly a story for another day. So what I'm trying to point out is when we center sexual assault and women's fight against it, temperance looks different, abolition looks different, women's rights looks different, suffrage looks different, and you know what else looks different? Civil rights. Here I'm drawing on the work of the historian Danielle McGuire in her fantastic book, At the Dark End of the Street. Here she points out how networks of African American women, networks founded by Ida B. Wells, by Mary Church Terrell, the founding president of the National Association of Colored Women, had existed since the 1870s, 1880s, in large part to help defend women of color from sexual assault and sexual violence. And it was these very networks that provided the grassroots structure and the basis of the civil rights movement as it emerges in the mid-20th century. And you can especially see this in the story of Rosa Parks and her trajectory. Rosa Parks is, again, another woman who is one of the very few women that gets a space in our textbooks. But like Ida B. Wells, I think she too often gets oversimplified and in many ways sanitized. Her story is told in such a way that omits her long training as an activist and the role that sexual violence played in her activism. So what Danielle McGuire has established and what many other scholars have followed up on, and some of the materials I've shared in the course materials elaborate on this, is that one of Rosa Parks' most important training moments, learning moments, happened 10 years before she was arrested for failing to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery. It happened when she went to help Reese Taylor in 1944. Reese Taylor was a young mother who was walking home from church one evening when she was stopped by a carload of 7 white men who gang raped her and left her to die on the side of the road. This, unfortunately, was not unusual in Alabama in the 1940s or in any of the decades before the 1940s. What was unusual is that Reese Taylor pressed charges. Her story came to the attention of the NAACP, and the NAACP sent a young investigator named Rosa Parks to investigate, to help build the case, to publicize the case, which made its way all the way through NAACP networks and the Black press throughout the country. No white men were ever brought to justice or charged in the case, even though some of the perpetrators confessed to the crime. So this is a story, too, that we can see the impact of sexual violence and the leadership of Black women in combating sexual violence and how we center sexual assault, it really changes the stories we tell about our nation and the trajectories of our leaders and even the civil rights movement. So that is the conclusion of point number 2. So I'm going to end, and I'll leave it on this beautiful portrait of Reese Taylor and see what questions, comments, and discussions you have.
Thank you, Professor Hamlin. There was a question here from Rose in Memphis, and her question is about the concept of consent. What did consent mean in the late 19th century?
That's a great question. Consent was the first way that women began advocating for bodily autonomy. They generally could not say things like rape or sexual assault, and up until the 1960s and 1970s, there was no such thing as marital rape, meaning it was just assumed that a wife's body was the purview and property of her husband. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the 19th century women's rights leader, even went so far as to describe traditional marriage as legalized prostitution, because she said basically, if women can't say no to their husbands, and if women can't support themselves economically without husbands, really what's the difference? A wife sells herself to one man for survival, and a prostitute sells herself to multiple men. But at the end of the day, she basically said they're both forms of prostitution. So there was no sense of consent. Women in the 1870s in the women's rights movement began advocating for what they called voluntary motherhood. And voluntary motherhood basically meant the right to say no to your husband. And some, egalitarian, forward-thinking husbands were fine with this. Some even advocated for it and urged their reformist brethren to do things like practice withdrawal or leave their wives alone when their wives said no. But it cannot be said that this was the norm. And of course, women of color, especially African-American women in the South, had no expectation of consent when it came to white men who had used sexual violence as one of the most potent tools of white supremacy, for generations.
Thank you. Amy in Massachusetts would like to know more about the relationship between Native American women, Latinx women, those individuals who were out west in that late 19th century period. Where do they fall in terms of this concept of consent?
I would say it's a similar story. So in my syllabus, we look at some primary sources from Native American women and also Latinx women in the West. Many women who accompanied, white westward expanders, so to speak, as more or less concubines, which was another form of sexualized enslavement. We also talk about Chinese and Chinese American women who worked as sex workers in California and what that meant for them. So I would say there's a commonality of lack of consent and lack of bodily autonomy, and the other commonality is sexual violence as a tool of white supremacy.
Thank you. There is a question here about the response. So Reese Taylor, being brave and bold, went to authorities. How common was that, and what were the repercussions within her own personal life? If you have any information on that.
Yes, for all the details, I would steer you to some. Sorry, was there more to share?
No. Just that Christopher in San Francisco would like to know more.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. I would steer you. There's a documentary about her. There's some materials that I posted in the supplementary materials and to Danielle McGuire's at the Dark End of the Street that really delve more into this. But in brief, I would say it was not at all common for a woman to come forward. That's in part what made it remarkable, and in part it's because Rosa Parks happened to be the NAACP worker who went to help. And it really served as a galvanizing case for women and men throughout the United States as they read about it in the Black press and through the NAACP networks. The consequences for Reese Taylor were that she had to move. And I think, although I may be misremembering this, I think she also ended up having a hard personal life. I think she lost her child to death, not that it was the unrelated to the coming forward, but just that was another tragedy she had to endure.
Thank you, Professor Hamlin.
Mm-hmm.
If you would like to move on to section 3,
okay.
I think we may.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for these so thoughtful questions. Okay, point number 3. Sexual harassment and assault are baked into women's paid labor from the very beginning. Sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination. That's what makes it illegal under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But as the legal historian Reva Siegel has argued, sexual harassment is also a deeply entrenched social practice dating back as long as women have worked outside the home. To give just a few examples, one would be domestic servants. From emancipation through the mid-20th century, domestic service was by far the most common profession for women of color. Women of color tended to work 6 days a week in white people's homes with little to no workplace protections, meaning they continued to be subjected to frequent abuse and assault, often of a sexual nature, with little to no recourse. Similarly, the women and girls who worked in factories, most often textile-related factories, from the 1840s through the 1920s and beyond, had little or no workplace protections. For women working in factories, they tended to work in feminized labor groups under an all-powerful male boss with little or no protections. It was nearly impossible for them to unionize, though they did try mightily and enjoy some success in the 1910s, as I'm sure you teach in your classes. But male bosses continued to have near total control over the women's schedules and their bodies. Sexual assault and harassment was not really even discussed as a possible reform by women labor leaders, even though they knew they were pervasive problems, because women understood sexual harassment and assault to be so pervasive in the workplace, and because they knew that if they were to even bring up sexual harassment, the women themselves would be blamed. Like my student that I mentioned at the beginning, female workers throughout the 19th century and early 20th century simply understood that sexual harassment and assault were the cost of working outside the home. What about for women who began to work in offices? Well, in the late 19th century, there was a huge growth of industrial capitalism following the Civil War, which brought with it inventions like the typewriter and the stapler. This gave rise to the feminized job of the secretary. Before the Civil War, secretary had been a male job, sort of like apprentice, where you would follow in the boss's footsteps and one day hope to be the boss. But after the Civil War, the job fundamentally changes. It becomes a paper-pushing job designed to help the many new middle managers of corporate America file, alphabetize, staple, and sort their paperwork. By the 1920s, secretary becomes almost entirely feminized, with women comprising more than 90% of the secretarial labor pool, and the job itself changed to be more or less an office wife, as dramatized by the hit TV show Mad Men. So as anyone who has watched Mad Men knows, sexual favors, consensual or otherwise, were often considered a part of the secretary's job. You would get the boss coffee, you would get a present for his wife, and you would also be available, whether you liked it or not, to provide sexual favors. This is also, of course, hilariously dramatized in the fantastic movie 9 to 5. Thanks to the gains of second-wave feminism and the civil rights movement, increasing numbers of women of all races begin entering professional schools and jobs in the 1970s and 1980s. But As pioneering legal scholar Catherine McKinnon explained in her classic 1979 book, The Sexual Harassment of Working Women, sexual harassment remained endemic to women's daily lives in the workplace. Why? Well, she argues, sexual harassment perpetuates the interlocked structure by which women have been kept sexually enthralled to men and at the bottom of the labor market. It's here, she says, that the two forces of American society converge: men's control over women's sexuality and capital's control over employees' work lives. So she begins to articulate that sexual harassment is a form of sex-based discrimination prohibited by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The Supreme Court agrees. In the case Meritor Savings Bank v. Vinson, this is from 1986. Here, the Supreme Court upheld the idea that sexual harassment was a form of sex discrimination. The Vinson in the case was Michelle Vinson, who was fired from her job as a bank teller. She sued, arguing that her supervisor had created a hostile environment for her to continue to work in. In a unanimous ruling, the Supreme Court agreed, thus validating and expanding the definition of sexual harassment to also include hostile environment, not just quid pro quo. Vinson, you may not be surprised to learn, is an African-American woman who built on the long history of Black women's leadership in fighting sexual assault and harassment. And I want to emphasize here, too, the importance of the hostile environment definition of sexual harassment. Catherine McKinnon writes about it as emerging very precisely when women begin to enter male-dominated jobs. She distinguishes between quid pro quo, if you do this for me, I do that for you, sexual harassment, which had predominated in the male boss secretary or male boss factory floor type scenarios. That didn't exactly fly when women become lawyers, doctors, stockbrokers, when they held, technically, at least on paper, jobs that are the equal to men's. Then men pioneer a new form of harassment, basically locker room culture, to remind women of their outsider status. So hostile environment is perhaps a more subtle form of sexual harassment, but no less pervasive or damaging than quid pro quo. And of course, I'm guessing that many of you are old enough to remember the case that brought this to the public attention, and that made sexual harassment front page news and dinner table conversation in 1991, and that's, of course, the testimony of Anita Hill during Clarence Thomas's Supreme Court confirmation hearings. I'm guessing that many of you will remember Anita Hill's testimony here, so I'm not going to say too much about it tonight, except to say she is another important part of this long history of Black women leading the campaign against sexual harassment and sexual assault, and to point out that her story is a shocking revelation for my students who were born in the early 2000s, yours maybe even younger, and who came of age during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and literally have no idea who is Anita Hill and who is Clarence Thomas. I also really like to teach this primary source that's included in your materials called African American Women in Defense of Ourselves. And this is a newspaper ad that 1,600 African American women wrote, signed onto, and printed and distributed in newspapers across America to put Anita Hill's testimony in this long historical context that we've been talking about, and to point out the intersectional nature of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and to fundamentally say, we believe Anita Hill. So this is another wonderful source to incorporate, I think, in our classrooms. Now, at the same time that second wave feminists and women of color were instigating conversations about sexual harassment, so too were they revolutionizing our understanding of rape and sexual violence, which, like harassment, had long been understood as a sex crime related to the sexual double standard, and not necessarily as a political or civil rights crime about power. In the 1960s and 1970s, second wave feminists began to re-articulate rape as an act of terror and to redefine rape as a political crime, a tool of violence used to maintain women's, and especially women of color's, subordination to men. So this is the primary source I included. There are many. Rape, an act of terror. This is also when we see activists begin to band together to form things like rape crisis centers, take back the night marches, and Sexual Assault Awareness Month that we are marking today. Also in 1991, just a few months before Anita Hill's courageous testimony, a brave young college student from William and Mary named Katie Costner instigated a national conversation about so-called date rape. If, like me, you went to college in the 1990s, you may recall how revolutionary this reframing was. And this is why I particularly appreciated Mike's including of the Bikini Kill song in our opening mix. As women who went to school in the 1990s, we had been taught to understand date rape as our fault, as something not to be spoken about, as something simply to be endured. Katie Costner helped us understand that date rape is fundamentally rape, and there's really no difference. She too paid a huge personal cost for this, and she remains an activist to this day. And I think it's interesting to think about this as happening again, just a few months apart from Anita Hill's testimony. Bringing it more to the present, in 2017, thousands of bold women, led by Tarana Burke, who began the movement in 2006, made Me Too an international movement. And for months, women across the world breathed a sigh of relief as we were finally able to articulate things that had been fundamentally unspeakable just months before. Catherine McKinnon, the legal theorist who helped make sexual harassment a crime, even opined in the New York Times in 2018 that the Me Too movement has done what the law could not. And here I want us to think about, does that ring true today? What do we think about the reforms that have happened? What reforms have not happened? And what would we still like to see? I've included this op-ed as one of the supplemental materials, and perhaps as a conversation starter that you could use with your students. The National Women's Law Center has been tracking state, federal, and local policy changes that have happened in the wake of Me Too, and they found that, yes, many laws have changed. As you see here, 19 plus states have enacted new protections for survivors, including prohibiting non-disclosure agreements. 11 plus states, including New York City, have strengthened anti-harassment training for companies, and 6 states have expanded to protections to freelance employees, interns, and volunteers. More recently, Title VII protections have been extended to include gender identification and sexual orientation, but the report finds that most of these revised laws are still very narrowly focused and still overlook and/or obscure the intersectional nature of sexual violence, meaning it's often about race, sex, and gender, and they overlook its historical roots in our institutions, our policies, and our workplaces. Another comprehensive report that I recommend to you was compiled by the Better Life Lab in 2018, and this was a cross-industry survey of sexual harassment. And they found that sexual harassment is often driven by narratives, myths, and norms about women, men, and workers. Again, not an interpersonal, one-time, one bad apple story. They also found that most reporting systems don't work, and that solutions must be targeted and aimed at changing culture, systems, and structures. So that is what we are doing tonight. Here we are in 2022, building on the successes and triumphs and failures of these women and a few men we have talked about tonight who have come before us and who have helped shine a light on our nation's long history of sexual violence and of obscuring the ways in which sexual violence has been used as a tool of white supremacy. These stories have been obscured by simultaneous celebrations of toxic masculinity and by upholding the sexual double standard. What can we do? Well, first, we must understand sexual violence as a system and as endemic, directly related to racism and not as interpersonal or individual. We must also understand that political autonomy and bodily autonomy are hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. And finally, it is our job as educators and historians to mine the archive, to shine light on our history's complexities, and to center the stories of the women who have come before us. As I said earlier, we cannot continue to teach patriarchy and expect equality. The stories we tell about ourselves as a nation and as a people shape what we think is possible today and in the future. Thank you so much. I really look forward to your questions and discussions.
Thank you so much, Professor Hamlin. You can't see it and you can't hear it, but there's clapping going on, I'm sure. That was wonderful. I'm really deeply appreciative of it. I actually want to start off with a comment that Carrie offered actually at the beginning of the talk, but I think it's a really powerful comment and certainly speaks to what you've been talking about in this latter section. And that is, as she says, I can't believe the anxiety this subject brings up. Women are taught to forget and move on from sexual violence, so we do. But it's so important that we educate people, workplaces, teachers, students to end this insanity. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
I actually want to go back to something that Carrie mentioned, which is women are taught to forget and move on from sexual violence, so we do. I'm intrigued by this idea of taught to forget, and you were certainly speaking to that. But could you say more about that sort of the idea of how we organize our classes, how we organize what we talk about, what we emphasize in our classrooms, how we might sort of help to intervene in that sort of culture of forgetting?
Yes, and again, I'm not trying to be pie in the sky. I know that depending on what state you are in, some of the things we are talking about, you absolutely cannot say. So some of this may be aspirational, some of this may be subtextual. I want to be very sensitive to that and say that I understand there's various limitations, especially that our K through 12 educators in public schools face. So I think there's a few ways we can do this. And one is simply to shine a light on some of the sort of patriarchal stories that we tell, and to emphasize, to talk maybe about Erica Armstrong Dunbar's book and research on the enslaved woman, Ona Judge, that George Washington held in captivity, and that George and Martha Washington basically chased for the rest of their lives after she managed to escape, right? To see this as not some sort of like incidental footnote to George Washington's life, but as, a really foundational and constitutive element of his life, right? Same could be said of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, or many other of the men that we have holidays to recognize and that take up, entire chapters of our textbooks, that we no longer give such a pass and say, oh, that's how it was, right? To really center the stories of the women. And when we look at the women, how does that also reframe the men to which they are often, conjoined with in our books, in our textbooks, and in our stories? Another way I think we can do this is through primary sources. So that's why I think, like Ida B. Wells, Harriet Jacobs, Rosa Parks even, these are primary sources that probably would be non-controversial, or maybe would be non-controversial to include, or maybe already are included. And that you could simply just, knowing that these are part of the stories, without even maybe saying, just somehow the sorts of questions that you ask about them, the contextual material you provide to help students understand them, could help students make these connections on their own. Another way I think that we can bring up some of this history, even within what are sometimes restrictive state standards, is to look to local history. So that's, for example, why I love I've lost my voice a little. That's why I love the example of Carrie Clyde Holly from Colorado, right? You are just simply talking about the first woman elected to office. What? Right? Oh, and she also has the distinction of introducing the first piece of legislation ever proposed by a female legislator in America. Who could be opposed to that? Oh, what was it about? Oh, well, maybe we should talk about that and what women's lives were like in the 19th century. So those are some ideas. Centering the women who are often subsumed under the quote, great men, looking to the primary sources and highlighting local history examples.
Thank you so much. There's actually a question here from Terrence in Dallas, who is thinking about our current moment with the Ukraine, and how is it that we sort of think about this longer history of the military and rape as a tool of war?
Oh my gosh, that is such a great question. And you're right, I only talked domestically. I did not talk about war or the way in which rape has been really one of the most brutal tools of war also for centuries. So for people teaching international classes, comparative classes, global history, that is a great idea and an important way to bring in this history, I think, highlighting the realities of war and also the way in which sexual violence is used to subdue cultures, and in particularly women, and generally marginalized women in whichever culture is under siege at the time. I think, Terrence, that is a great suggestion.
And actually, sort of moving on in a sort of a similar note in terms of our current moment and also thinking about the military. Robert in Greenville, Mississippi wants to know your thoughts about what is happening currently with the case with Major General Bill Cooley.
I have not been following that super closely, I have to say, so I don't have too many thoughts on that. Go ahead.
Just for those folks who don't know this case, he's an Air Force general who is standing trial for kissing and groping a civilian woman, and is the first general to be, in fact, put on trial, and the first to have sexual assault charges that have led to criminal prosecution.
Yes, so I've seen the headlines. I don't know too in depth. One, in my Me Too class, we do talk about rape in the military, and we talk a lot about the efforts of people like Senator Kristen Gillibrand of New York to really change the reporting culture and the reporting structure of sex crimes within the military. So I'm eager to see how this case plays out. And I think, kind of like Terrence was saying about rape as a war crime, we also need to investigate rape within our own military and the way in which it's used to maintain white male rule, usually.
Thank you, Professor Hamlin.
Yeah.
This is a question that I have actually about, you sort of mentioned as you, at the opening, that you were, in terms of thinking about, you did not see women as full citizens. I'm going to take that 19th century term. On a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate in this current moment women's self-sovereignty, if you will, with 1 being sort of the lowest and 5 being the highest in terms of fully embodied self-sovereignty?
Okay, 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I like many historians and legal historians, I think that we are going to see Roe v. Wade overturned this summer. And so, assuming, unfortunately, in my mind that happens, I would say we're maybe a 2 or a 3. I think if you are a 12-year-old girl who is forced to bear a child that was conceived of rape, you cannot remotely say that women have bodily autonomy in the United States. Most of these new state-based anti-abortion laws have no clauses about rape or age or health of the mother. So I think that puts us pretty low down on the autonomy scale in my mind. And similarly, I think the attacks on voting rights that we've seen since 2020, the record number of municipal and state laws designed to restrict voting rights, especially for people and women of color, I think is really troubling. And that too also inclines me to put us low down on the scale of autonomy. One of the things I talked about a lot, so Freethinker came out in 2020, and so I did a lot of suffrage centennial events around that. And, you know, that I would always end my talks by talking about voting rights and reminding us all, right, that there is no constitutional amendment that says everyone can vote, right? That says citizenship equals voting rights. Instead, we have a hodgepodge of laws that are often more restrictive than enabling. And that I think that is really the number one problem that we face today is ensuring, protecting, and expanding voting rights. If we were to have really robust voting rights, I don't think that we would be overturning Roe v. Wade, for example, or having some of the debates we're having about vaccines or climate science or whatever other issues might, animate public discourse in your towns.
Thank you, Professor Hamlin. And this may be the last question, but an important one from Bernadette in Los Angeles. And she's thinking about Tarana Burke and her Me Too movement and her efforts to invest the movement with some joy. And she wondered if you could say something more about your experience with your own students as you investigate into what is really hard history.
Oh my gosh, I love that question. I love that question. Thank you for allowing us to think about that and end on that note. And I also love that is such an important core part of Tarana Burke's message, that we think about the joy. And believe it or not, we did have so much joy in my Me Too class. One of the things that Zoom enabled us to do was we could invite authors like the authors of Sexual Citizens and like Michelle Boulder to come to our class and talk with us about their books that we had read and loved. And so that was really fulfilling. And our classroom community really did come to fruition. And what our final assignment of the semester was to try to put into action some of the things we had learned throughout the semester. So each student looked at a various part of our campus laws, our campus culture, and wrote a proposal for change that was informed by their research and by our course materials. So it was really thrilling to see those proposals come to light and feel like, oh gosh, some of these might also, maybe even they might happen. And then when the pandemic began, when we all were vaccinated in the spring, I even invited a bunch of the students over to my house for dinner. We sat outside and I got us all medals from this trophy store near my house. And the medals said, we survived 2020 and 2021. And we wore our medals proudly. And many of the students who are graduating even wore them over their cap and gown, which I just loved. So yes, we did find much joy together in sharing our stories and in working for change.
Thank you, Professor Hamlin. That was astounding. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you for your time and your wonderful, thoughtful questions.
Absolutely. And thank you both. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining and leading us and sharing your expertise with us all. As I look through the chat, I see everyone who is saying, wow, thank you, thank you, thank you, and extending virtual applause. I'd encourage everyone who's here tonight to keep up with what's going on at the National Humanities Center through our various social media feeds to get updates on our activities. I'd also like to invite you to join us again on April 28th for the Causes, Controversies, and Consequences of Brexit webinar. Dr. Daniel Kellerman who will be here as well. And share this with your coworkers and others in your network. Also, before we leave, we also like to extend a few resources to you all. Tisha is including them in the chat right now for anyone who may be facing any issues with sexual assault. Please know that there are resources that are available for you. And Tisha, are you still there?
I am.
And I know they were included in the chat, but if you would like to let them know about them as well, we appreciate that.
So again, for those individuals, if you are feeling like you need to reach out to someone, the National Sexual Assault Hotline is 24 hours. The number again is 1-800-656-4673, 1-800-656-4673. And again, as Professor Hamlin mentioned, RAIN.org has an entire series of links to various organizations that is absolutely worth visiting, and please reach out there as well.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Everyone have a great evening, and we hope you have an awesome week ahead of you all. And stay safe, and we will see you all soon. Have a good night.
Tisha, are you still here?
I am still here.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. I have no idea how you distilled all that into such great questions, but thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It was wonderful. Honestly, it's I just can't wait. Thank you also for that treasure trove of resources. I cannot wait to bring them to class. Oh my goodness.
Oh, good.
It's just been wonderful. I've learned so much, and I'm really deeply appreciative of it.
Well, I'm so grateful for the opportunity. Thank you both so much. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Tisha.
Thank you. Be well.
You too.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Goodbye.